Junior was crying in his mother's living room. A male teacher was trying to help him with his assignment, but he threw tantrums. Mrs. Shubomi had entered Mrs. Oloro's apartment to greet her. They had become good friends in the past few weeks, so they entered each other's houses at will. Mrs. Shubomi looked surprised at the sight that greeted her. Junior was crying profusely, while the male teacher was trying so hard to get him to cooperate. Mrs. Shubomi checked her wristwatch. It was 6 p.m. She wondered why a 5 years old boy, who returned home for school by 5 p.m., would still face the agony of doing an extra lesson at home. She went into the kitchen and saw Mrs. Oloro there. Mrs. Oloro, who was trying to prepare some snacks for Junior, welcomed her gleefully. Mrs. Shubomi wasn't interested in small talks. "What's going on there in your living room?" she asked. Mrs. Oloro looked confused. "How do you mean? Why is your 5-year-old boy being subjected to excessive academic exercise? Is it not enough that he has to close from school by 5 p.m. daily?" she asked with a displeased tone. Mrs. Oloro went on to explain how he wasn't catching up and he wasn't writing the basic letters he ought to be writing. Unconvinced, Mrs. Shubomi insisted it wasn't the right thing to do and mentioned that the boy ought to be resting. "You're a parent now and you know how these children are. The same way something motivated you to enroll a teacher for your son is the same reason I am doing this for my son," said Mrs. Oloro. Curious, Mrs. Shubomi asked, "Oh, did you do this because I hired a teacher for my son?" Mrs. Oloro chuckled and said, "Who no like better thing?" Mrs. Shubomi sighed and let the matter rest. Meanwhile, Mrs. Shubomi had hired a teacher for her son because of a quiz competition he had been selected for. Later that day, Mrs. Oloro had sat in her room, reminiscing the conversation. She knew she was such a copycat and had planned to stop it when she realized the huge debt she was accumulating to live a fake life. But stopping it has been difficult. When she was married to her husband in their former apartment, there was this really attractive and successful woman that lived close to them that her ex-husband usually compared her with. Her ex was making a lot of money then. She wasn't working, so he gave her what was barely enough. He would compare her many times to the neighbor by telling her to copy good things from her. She had this a million times from her husband. She didn't know the damage that had been done to her. Later on, her husband lost his job and he blamed it on her lack of self-development, which took a toll on him as the only provider in the house. He began to maltreat her and she left the house. It took massive contributions from her siblings to get her to rent an apartment and start a business. Since then, she had told herself subconsciously many times that she needed to copy good things. Mrs. Shubomi didn't know she was copying her. She had believed they just had similar ways of thinking. It occurred to her much later that Mrs. Oloro wanted to be like her. As for her son's extra lesson, she had to stop the teacher after 1 week of consistent crying from her boy. Neighbors would knock and ask why Junior was crying non-stop. It was getting embarrassing, so she stopped. Meanwhile, she had made a full payment to the teacher for a month's job. She bit her lips for the wasted funds. One evening, she went to Mrs. Shubomi's flat. An aroma greeted her nose as she went in. Curious, she went into the kitchen, hoping to see her friend there, but it was a strange lady cooking. The lady had seen her and introduced herself as a maid. She asked after Mrs. Shubomi. and she told her she was shooting a video for her YouTube channel. Mrs. Oloro waited, and after 40 minutes, she came into the living room. Surprised to see her friend, she greeted her. "You own a YouTube channel?" Mrs. Oloro asked. "Yes, I do. You didn't know?" Mrs. Shubomi went on to explain how she has 60,000 subscribers on YouTube. Surprised, Mrs. Oloro asked, "How were you able to achieve that? Judging from the fact that you go to work every day and arrive home late in the evening." Mrs. Shubomi smiled. "Why do you think I hire people to cook and do my chores for me? You think it is for me to play? I don't really do much chores at home, so I don't have enough time to do whatever I want." "Does YouTube fetch you good money?" asked Mrs. Oloro. Mrs. Oloro screamed, "Yes." Later that evening, Mrs. Oloro sat on her bed, thinking. Something that her friend said had struck her. She didn't just outsource her chores out of laziness or wanting to play away her precious time. It was because she was busy with other important things that could help elevate her. She compared it to herself. She had outsourced many things in her home. She wasn't building anything tangible during those free time. Aside being a kitchen utensil vendor, she wasn't learning any skill. Her flamboyant lifestyle had been sponsored by her siblings, who were already complaining. She was beginning to see how foolish she was. She has been copying foolishly. No wonder she was always broke and looking for where to borrow money from. Therefore, she decided to have a side hustle too. She decided to have her own YouTube channel. She went online, and after a few minutes of research, she was able to create a channel. Excitedly, she was able to draw 3 videos in 1 week, after which she abandoned the channel. She avoided telling Mrs. Shubomi because she didn't want it to be clear to her that she was copying her. Mrs. Oloro noticed that Mrs. Shubomi, despite not going to the office on weekends, always had one event or the other to go. And no, they weren't parties, because her attires were always formal. When she asked her one day about it, Mrs. Shubomi replied that it was for networking. Mrs. Oloro had kept that at the back of her mind, refusing to ask any questions about it, because she didn't want to sound like an illiterate before her. She later checked the dictionary for the meaning of networking, and she saw that it meant the act of meeting people. She jumped at it. She started attending ceremonies, introducing herself to different strangers. About 2 of them had sent her a request to be their sexual partner. Women like her. She stopped. She wondered how her friend did hers. One bright afternoon, Mrs. Shubomi sent her an invite to a seminar. She had seen the invitation in her mail and wondered what prompted Mrs. Shubomi to invite her. Pleased, though, she sent her reply, promising to be there. She hadn't even been able to see Mrs. Shubomi for a week, despite living in the same compound. Mrs. Shubomi had been coming in late. Her son has not been around too. She wondered where she took him. She planned to ask her questions later. The next weekend, she was sitting pretty in her suit beside Mrs. Shubomi, who rocked a two-piece attire. Both listened attentively at the speaker. At first, Mrs. Oloro had busied herself with pressing her phone, but when she realized her friend kept her phone away, she did the same. The topic of the seminar turned out to be what she needed. It was a seminar on self-esteem. The speaker was a seasoned therapist, and he mentioned many symptoms of low self-esteem. Mrs. Oloro could relate to many of them. Later on, the speaker asked them to write a 5-year breakdown of what they wanted to become and how they planned to achieve it. They both grabbed papers and started writing. Mrs. Shubomi started writing immediately, giving a detailed heading and sub-headings for each stage. Mrs. Oloro stared into space, and for 10 minutes she couldn't write anything. Mrs. Shubomi raised her head and looked at her. "You aren't writing anything?" she queried. I I I don't know what to write," she replied. Mrs. Shubomi looked surprised. She thought she was joking, but true to her words, the only thing she could write after the expiration of the time allotted to them was, "I want to have a big kitchen utensils shop." No breakdown of her plans to achieve that. Mrs. Shubomi started seeing in clear terms her weakness and her lack. Later that day, Mrs. Shubomi took her out on a dinner date, an act which melted Mrs. Oloro's heart. She hasn't had a dinner date for like eternity. After their sumptuous meal, Mrs. Shubomi looked into her eyes, and in soft tones she asked, "Mrs. Oloro, can I meet you? Tell me about yourself, starting from your first name, your failed marriage and everything." Surprised but happy, Mrs. Oloro spilled everything to her, and unconsciously she mentioned why she had been living a fake life, copying her and others around. This confirmed what Mrs. Shubomi had observed. She went on to admonish her. "Thanks for trusting me with this. I don't take it for granted. There is nothing wrong with copying. It is how you have been going about it that has been wrong. You can copy principles, but you must tailor it to your size, your shape, and your material," she said. Mrs. Oloro looked confused. It's okay to observe that someone around you is hardworking and you want to emulate. What you should do is to apply it to your existing niche and your existing patterns, not that you abandon your career or skill to pick up that person's own. Like the other time you hired a teacher for your 5-year-old boy, just because I did the same for mine. Do you know I hired him a teacher because he was to represent his school in a competition? Did you have that information then? No. You only saw a part of it and ran with it. Mrs. Oloro looked shocked at the information. She listened to Mrs. Shubomi, who spent the next 1 hour telling her of the need to find herself and what she truly wants to be. When they were done, she booked an appointment between her and a therapist and paid for the first 2 sections. Mrs. Oloro was eternally grateful to her. After her sections were completed, she could conveniently write down a 5-year plan of what she wanted to become, and she has started executing step number 1 under the supervision of her friend. One of the people Mrs. Shubomi made her network with the day she took her out on a seminar was instrumental to helping her achieve the first step. She realized that Mrs. Shubomi was strategic with her networking that day. She has answered a lot of questions in the class. She had answered a lot of questions in the class and had gone on to meet the high and mighty among the audience after the event. She heaved a sigh of relief and kept admiring her personality.